Random House Audio presents The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 50th Anniversary Edition with a new introduction by Jason Epstein and a foreword by the author, Jane Jacobs. Read for you by Donna Rawlins. Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was born on May 4, 1916, in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Her father was a physician, and her mother taught school and worked as a nurse. After high school and a year spent as a reporter on the Scranton Tribune, Jacobs went to New York, where she found a succession of jobs as a stenographer and wrote freelance articles about the city's many working districts, which fascinated her. In 1952, after a number of writing and editing jobs ranging in subject matter from metallurgy to a geography of the United States for foreign readers, she became an associate editor of Architectural Forum. She was becoming increasingly skeptical of conventional planning beliefs as she noticed that the city rebuilding projects she was assigned to write about seemed neither safe, interesting, alive, nor good economics for cities once the projects were built and in operation. She gave a speech to that effect at Harvard in 1956, and this led to an article in Fortune magazine entitled "Downtown is for People," which in turn led to the death and life of great American cities. The book was published in 1961 and produced permanent changes in the debate over urban renewal and the future of cities. In opposition to the kind of large-scale bulldozing government intervention in city planning associated with Robert Moses and with federal slum clearing projects, Jacobs proposed a renewal from the ground up, emphasizing mixed use rather than exclusively residential or commercial districts, and drawing on the human vitality of existing neighborhoods. Vital cities have marvelous innate abilities for understanding, communicating, contriving, and inventing what is required to combat their difficulties. Lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration, with energy enough to carry over for problems and needs outside themselves. Although Jacobs' lack of experience as either architect or city planner drew criticism, The Death and Life of Great American Cities was quickly recognized as one of the most original and powerfully argued books of its day. It was variously praised as the most refreshing, provocative, stimulating, and exciting study of this greatest of our problems of living which I have seen, Harrison Salisbury, and a magnificent study of what gives life and spirit to the city, William H. White. Jacobs married an architect who she said taught her enough to become an architectural writer. They had 2 sons and a daughter. In 1968, they moved to Toronto, where Jacobs often assumed an activist role in matters relating to development and was an advisor on the reform of the city's planning and housing policies. She was a leader in the successful campaign to block construction of a major expressway on the grounds that it would do more harm than good, and helped prevent the demolition of an entire downtown neighborhood. Her writings include The Economy of Cities, 1969, The Question of Separatism, 1980, A Consideration of the Issue of Sovereignty for Quebec, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, 1984, A Major Study of the Importance of Cities and Their Regions in the Global Economy, and Systems of Survival, 1993. She died April 25, 2006. Introduction by Jason Epstein. I first heard of Jane Jacobs in 1956 when a friend suggested that I read her article, Downtown is for People, in Fortune, in which she laid out the case against Le Corbusier's radiant city ideology, which had infected much post-war city planning, including that of New York City's master builder, Robert Moses. I was immediately sympathetic to Jane's argument that cities are complex organisms that create their own logic, but are in danger of being smothered by the arrogant fantasies of modernist planners with their sinuous interchanges, sterile towers, and depopulated vistas. I had lived for a while in Greenwich Village, not far from Jane, and shared her devotion to that eccentric section of New York City with its streets and alleys of 19th century townhouses, its mixed commercial, residential, and industrial uses, and its cultural vitality, qualities distilled from the vigorous city itself, whose diverse economy of light industry, garment and shoe manufacturing, food processing, publishing, metalwork, electronics, graphics, and so on, made New York with its conurbation the largest manufacturing employer in the United States at that time. Unlike Detroit or Pittsburgh, New York was not defined by a dominant industry. New York was a cornucopia of possibility and improvisation, an incubator of vital neighborhoods and local citizenship. There were problems: segregation, slums, crime, redlining, a calcified school system, corruption, great and small, but the city and its enlightened citizens, one felt, were strong enough to overcome these miseries. Moses's high-rise slum clearance, however, was not a solution, but a brutal intensification of the problems, as Jane Jacobs argued in Downtown is for People, and at greater length in her masterpiece, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. I had been working for Doubleday at the time and offered Jane a contract for a book based on her Fortune article, which I had reprinted in a collection of essays called The Exploding Metropolis. 2 years later, I moved to Random House. Jane moved with me and in January 1961 delivered the manuscript of Death and Life, which I read without interruption or emendation. There was little to edit. I would eventually publish all but the last of the several books that followed, many composed on her old Remington, for which she must have laid in a supply of ribbons before typewriters became obsolete. Editors and their authors seldom form deep friendships for the same reason that psychiatrists and their patients keep their distance. The relationship requires candor, which mixes poorly with intimacy. Perhaps because her manuscripts needed little editing and were usually delivered on time, Jane and I were an exception to this rule. We were kindred spirits. She did not use a literary agent. We negotiated directly, book by book, and formed a lifelong intellectual and professional friendship that survived her move to Toronto during the Vietnam War. Together we explored eastern Canada, from the great provincial parks to the mining towns along the permafrost above the tree line, and still farther north to Moose Factory at the bottom of James Bay, a once flourishing entrepot of the Hudson's Bay Company, where we were surprised to find, amid the ramshackle Cree dwellings, 2 Chinese restaurants offering mets canadiens et chinois, a relic of the Chinese laborers who built the railroad in the 1920s that terminates there, an example, as Jane pointed out, of how one kind of work leads to another. We seldom discussed our personal lives. I knew that Jane's father had been a family physician and her mother a nurse, and that she was fond of her brother John, a federal judge, that she had been born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and had come to New York in 1943, hoping to become a journalist. I was not surprised to learn later from a biographer that she had been a defiant high school student with a sense of humor, a sharp eye for cant, and a problem for her uninspiring teachers, a contrarian even then. She was rewarded for her candor with poor grades and planned to skip college. She took instead courses in the extension program at Columbia, where she could take only the courses she wanted and write a book, Constitutional Chaff, which was published by the Columbia University Press, an impressive debut for a self-educated, non-matriculated, and uncredentialed scholar at the age of 25. The book was a study of the rejected proposals for the United States Constitution. Jane, who was her own best critic, refused to show me a copy and chose not to discuss this first effort. Like all of Jane's work, Death and Life is about how human beings, by their own devices, instinctively create vital communities and how these communities and their economies are subject.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?